Hi, this is Wendy. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm talking about how to substitute yarn in a knitting or crocheting project. This video follows my how to read a label video and gets more into the nitty-gritty of how to substitute for the yarn called for in your pattern. The first thing to consider is what is the yarn called for in your pattern. So let's say, for example, I wish to make these leg warmers. The first thing I need to consider is what yarn is it calling for and what is the weight of that yarn. So here it's calling for a Bernat satin yarn, 100-gram balls or skeins, and I would need, to make the smallest one, 2 balls of that, so 200 grams. Now it's not telling me what's the weight of that yarn. So if I wanted to know if that's a number 3 or number 4 yarn, a light worsted or a worsted, for example, I could go online, look up that particular yarn at this yarn company, and find out what the weight of that yarn is. The second thing I could do is look at something I've already got. So if I have this yarn on hand, I can look at the amount and see if it's similar. So in this case, I have 100 grams of this yarn. There's 180 meters in 100 grams. How do I know if that's the same as what's called for in the pattern? Well, there's one clue here with the gauge. It says that this yarn in the pattern will produce 18 stitches and 24 rows with larger needles in stocking stitch. So this is a knitting pattern, but it works the same for crochet. The larger needles that they're referring to are the 5mm needles. So when I look at my ball here, the needle suggestion on the side here is a 5mm needle, and it says 18 stitches and 24 rows. So this number 4 medium weight or worsted weight yarn with number 5 knitting needles is going to produce 18 stitches and 24 rows. And you can do the same thing with the crochet gauge here. So that lines up with the gauge on my pattern, 18 stitches and 24 rows with 5mm needles. So I can be pretty confident that this yarn is going to work for this pattern in a very similar way. So you could purchase the specific yarn, or you can look up the label online, or just compare it to something you already have. Another example is a wool yarn that I have here. Now this one's interesting. It doesn't have any number, so I don't know if it's a number 4 yarn or a worsted weight yarn. All it has is the number of yards and the number of grams. So interesting, imperial and metric. In Canada we do that a lot. We flip back and forth. So how would I know if this is similar to the other one? Well, I converted yards to meters, so I know that I have 183 meters of yarn in this skein, and there's 130 grams. So, I'll get my calculator here. 183 meters divided by 130 grams is about 1.4 meters per gram. Now acrylic is going to weigh slightly different than a wool, but it's still going to give you an idea if you're trying to figure out if you can substitute. So in this case, I have 180 meters per gram, so 1.8 So that tells me that I have more length per gram. So this wool, or sorry, this yarn is going to be, this acrylic yarn is going to be slightly lighter weight than this wool yarn. And maybe I can compensate by adjusting my needle size a little bit and go down a little bit on the needle size to get a similar result. So that's one possibility. But what if I wanted to use a different yarn altogether, or a different weight or thickness of yarn, or even put multiple strands together? The first thing to keep in mind if you want to switch to a different yarn is the amount per skein can vary. So make sure you are comparing apples to apples. So here I have 3 fingering weight yarns. These 2 are wool and this one is an acrylic. But what I wanted to point out here is that they're not all the same weight. So this is a 50-gram ball, this is an 110-gram ball, and this is a 100-gram ball. So make sure that if you are looking at different ones to compare, that you figure out how many grams per meter in order to compare it correctly. So if I look at this blue fingering weight yarn, there's 393 meters for 110 grams. So 393 meters divided by 110, there's 3.57 meters per gram. So 3.6, we'll round up a little bit. This other one is 400 meters per gram. So it's 4 meters, sorry, 400 per 100 grams. So 4 meters per gram. So this one is going to be slightly lighter than this one. So make sure you're comparing to the same weight when you're looking at the length of the yarn in the skein. Here's another example. These are DK weight yarns, or number 3 yarns. This wool yarn is 250 meters per 100 grams, so 2.5 meters per gram. This one is 110 grams, so we would have to divide 261 meters by 110 to figure out how much per gram. And this one is 100 again. So this one, 250 meters per gram, gives us 2.5 meters per gram, and this one at 200 gives us 2 meters per gram. So we know that this yarn is going to work up slightly heavier than this one. So that's digging a little bit into the nitty-gritty of the weight of the yarn. So what if you don't know the weight? I have a couple examples here. So here's my kitchen scale, and I bought this yarn. I'm pretty confident it's a wool, just from the appearance of it, but I bought it secondhand and it didn't have a label. So if I wanted to see how much I had there, I could just put it on my scale, 102 grams. It's probably supposed to be a 100-gram skein, but it, give or take, sometimes it's a little bit more. In this case, with this yarn, I have the length of it, 308 meters, but I don't know how much it weighs. So my scale would come in handy for that too. It says 123 grams for 308 meters. So if I wanted to know how much that was for 100 meters, how would I figure that out? Well, I'm not a math person, but here's the math. So 308 divided by 100, there's 3.08 times 100 meters in there. And if it's 123 grams, and I wanted to compare it to 100 grams, I would have to do 100 divided by 123. So this is 0.813 of this ball would equal 100 grams. It's 81% of this ball would equal 100 grams. So 81%, sorry, 0.81, 81% of these meters, so 81% of 308 meters would be 249.5, so 250 meters. So I would probably mark on this ball that it's 250 meters per 100 grams. That would allow me to compare with another one. This one is 115 grams and 350 yards. So again, we're mixing metric and imperial, but I put it into a conversion calculator and I know it's 320 meters per 115 grams. So 320 divided by 115, 2.8 meters per gram. And this other one was 250 meters per gram, we figured out with the conversion. So this one's going to give you a slightly smaller gauge. You can get a little bit more. It's 2.7 instead of 2.5. So compare apples to apples there. So if you have two separate weights, like we just had with these ones, we figured out this one is a slightly lighter weight than this one. We get more meters per gram than this one. You could go up a little bit on your hook size or needle size to try and compensate. You will have to do a swatch to figure out if they're the same, or a couple of swatches. We'll get back to swatching in a minute. What if I wanted to put two yarns together? First of all, my recommendation would be to stick to two yarns of the same type. So this is an acrylic, this is a cotton, and this is a wool. If I wanted to combine two things together, I would stick with one of those types. So two acrylics, two cottons, or two wools. Otherwise you get some weird staticky stuff going on and it doesn't wash properly. One kind will shrink differently than another kind. So stick to one type. Secondly, again, look at the meters per gram. So if we wanted to compare these two and I wanted to substitute one for the other, what would I do? Well, in this case, I know it's 400 meters per 100 grams, so about 4 meters per gram. This one is 200 meters per 100 grams. Well, that's a pretty easy conversion, right? So this one, 400 meters per gram, or 400 meters per 100 grams, so 4 meters per gram, and this one's 2 meters per gram. So I know that this one is twice as heavy as this one. And if I put two strands of this together, I could be fairly confident it's going to come out like this. Most importantly, do a swatch. So I already found out that this navy blue yarn has similar gauge to my pattern, so I could just substitute that one. But what if I wanted to use this one, which I've already figured out is a slightly heavier weight yarn? Well, I could compensate by changing up my needle size and go down to, say, a 4.5 millimeter instead of a 5 millimeter. Do a swatch and see if I come out to a similar gauge. The other option is to say, I'm just going to go up a larger size and maybe make a medium instead of a small. That's a little more risky and takes more math, but it is another option. We've already figured out that I could use 2 of this one to substitute for this one. This one is 250 meters per 100 grams, and this one's 200. So I know this one's slightly lighter, and it's not going to work to double it. It's going to be too heavy. So if I wanted to use one strand of this one instead of this one, I'm going to have to make some adjustments. So this label says the crochet gauge is 12 to 17 stitches over 4 inches. That's a pretty broad range. So 12 to 17 stitches over 4 inches. And the hook size, it says on there, is US 7 to I9. Now I don't know what that means because all of my hooks say millimeters. So I'm going to need some kind of a conversion chart. There's lots of them online. And this one compares the hook sizes, the recommended crochet hook sizes. So here it says a 7 is a 4.5 millimeter and an I9 is a 5.5 millimeter. Okay, so 4.5 to 5.5 millimeter hook to get that gauge. Now don't get tripped up here, because you might think, oh, I'll just put 4.5 under this one and 5.5 under this one. But if you think about it for a moment, a larger hook size is going to give you fewer stitches per inch. So this 12, I think I can assume, 12 stitches per 4 inches is made with a 5.5 millimeter hook. And this 17 stitches per 4 inches is with a smaller hook because I would get more stitches. All right, does that make sense? So if my pattern, say I'm making a blanket or a scarf, and instead of this yarn, I want to use the lighter weight one. And I want to use a let's say this one, the 5.5 millimeter hook. The math's a little easier for that one. So I know that in the heavier yarn, I'm going to get 12 stitches for every 4 inches. Right? 12 stitches like that. So if my scarf is supposed to be 12 inches wide, I am doing 3 repeats of this 4 inches. So I would know that I need to cast on 3 times 12 to get the 12 inches. So I would have to cast on or chain, whatever, if I'm doing single crochet, 36 stitches to equal this 12 inches. Now if I did a swatch in this yarn, and I figured out that instead of 12 stitches for every 4 inches, I'm actually getting 15 because it's slightly lighter. But I still want that 12 inches wide. What I would need to do is still do the same repeat, or 3 times the 4 inches to get 12 inches. So 3 times 15, I'm going to have to start with 45 stitches to equal those same 12 inches, because this is 15 stitches per 4 inches instead of 12. If I wanted to substitute a different yarn altogether for a pattern, and I just like the stitch pattern, so let's say for example I'm making a baby blanket in half double crochet like that, and I like this weight of yarn. I don't want to use the heavier weight yarn. I want to use the lighter weight yarn. the first thing I would need to know is what is the gauge of my sample or my swatch in the stitch that I'm looking to use. So in this half double crochet, I'll make a swatch and I will count up how many stitches and how many rows in that 4 inches. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. I have 18 stitches in this half double crochet. And I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, looks like 13 rows. So that's my gauge for this sample. Now let's say the blanket pattern I'm looking at with a completely different yarn has an overall size for the blanket of 40 inches. 40 inches wide, let's say. And let's say it's 40 by 50 inches long. So that's wide and that's long. Okay, so I need to figure out how many stitches do I need to get that same 40 inches when I'm using this yarn instead of the one called for in the pattern. So I would need to multiply by 10, right? So if 18 stitches gives me 4 inches and I need 40, I need to multiply this 18 by 10 to get 180 stitches. That will give me a 40-inch width. And the 13 rows in 4 inches. Well, first I need to figure out what's 50 divided by 4. How many repeats of that 13 rows are we going to do? So 50 divided by 4 is 12.5. So I need to do 12 and a half repeats of this 13 rows to get to my 50 inches. So 12 and a half times 13 rows means I need 162 and a half rows. So we're going to say 163 rows. So that's how I can get the same size of blanket using a different yarn and maybe even a different stitch. I just want to make sure that my swatch works out in measurements to what I'm trying to achieve in the end, so I don't end up with starting, say, with 200 stitches and end up with a blanket that's way too wide. So this will allow me to estimate what my finished size is going to be. So that's been kind of a long discussion about substituting yarns. I hope that you found it helpful. I would appreciate it if you could leave me a comment and let me know what you think, if you found it useful or if there's things I missed and I should pick up in another video. And if you've enjoyed this and you would like to hear more, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks for joining me.